Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to get started now. People will still join. Those are running a few minutes late, but being respectful of the time, we're going to get started. We're so happy to have all of you join us for this 90-minute webinar on faith communities responding to children during COVID-19. My name is Elizabeth Leroux. I'm Research Director at the Unit for Religion and Development Research. Now, as some of you may know, our unit specializes in delivering work around the world that helps faith communities think about how they can play a positive role in community development and social transformation. And we work especially in relation to tackling violence, different forms of violence and abuse. So some of you might have attended the GBV webinar, the GBV and COVID one we did about a month ago. We're really happy then to have you here again. And a few weeks before that one, we had one on hunger and COVID-19. Those recordings are all available on the URDR's website. We will post the link in the chat box in a little bit. But everyone here today, thank you so much for making the time. We're really happy to have you here. I just need to note that it is my colleague, Selena Palm, who organized this whole webinar. But as she is an international expert on religion and violence against children, she's one of the speakers. So she just asked me to facilitate. But thank you, Selena, for organizing all of this, for putting it all together, for putting the time in. Now we have a big group together, more than 100 people registered for the webinar. So hopefully a few will turn up still. But thank you all for making time. And then, of course, a special thank you to our three speakers, Christina Nombu, Daniel Musaji, and Selena Palm. Just a quick reminder, everyone, please mute yourself. I will introduce these three speakers in a little while, but so long, I just want to say thank you. So the housekeeping rules for today, please keep yourself on mute the whole time. We're a big group, so as you can hear, if you don't unmute, it is quite disturbing and breaks the flow. So we emailed you the instructions a few days ago about how to do that, but please check at the bottom of your screen. There should be like a line through the video and a line through the mic. So don't unmute yourself, please. It really makes it difficult for the speakers. We won't be taking voice questions at the end of the webinar, but please do use the chat box, the chat function, and post your questions there. You can add your name, and you can also direct it to a specific speaker. I will be checking the chat box the whole time, and then at the end of their presentations, I will direct the questions. We won't be taking questions directly after each speaker, but we'll do a big Q&A at the end. To use the meeting chat, click on the conversation bubble in the control strip at the bottom of your screen, and then the meeting chat will appear. So just keep in mind that it is a public chat, so anyone who has joined can see what is written. And then also remember, please, that the webinar is being recorded. So if you wish to remain anonymous, make sure your video is off, keep yourself muted. And then when you enter the room, you should not have entered your name. Now, each of our speakers will have about 12 minutes for their presentation, and it will include a slideshow. And then each speaker will pass on to the next one before we come back to me, and we'll facilitate the Q&A then. So I hope that makes sense to everyone. So just give me a final few minutes to introduce our three speakers. So our first speaker, I'm introducing them in the order that they'll be speaking, is Dr. Selena Palm. She's a researcher at the Unit for Religion and Development Research, and she works for global clients on the issues of faith, development, and violence, with a focus on children. She holds a PhD in theology and development from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, as well as a range of social science qualifications. Before she joined the URDR in 2017, she was a development practitioner for over 10 years with faith-based organizations, local churches and mosques across sub-Saharan Africa, working with them to help them develop responses to another pandemic, that of HIV and AIDS. She's now a lay leader. She's now also a lay leader in her local congregation, Moronabos United Church. And there she's been grappling with the questions about supporting children and youth under COVID-19. Our second speaker is Christina Nomdu. Derek, can you go to the next slide where it shows our three speakers? I think I think it's the next one. There you go. Christina Nomdu was appointed as the first Commissioner for Children in the history of South Africa. She is appointed in the Western Cape Province and has oversight powers and duties to understand the impact of government on the needs, interests, and rights of children. In particular, she's charged to monitor, investigate, and research matters related to the service delivery mandates of the Departments of Education, Health, Social Development, Cultural Affairs, and Sport. Her particular passion is for child participation and governance. Now, previously, she served on the National Planning Commission and is a head of child protection of a child protection organization. And she's currently a PhD candidate in child rights and a master's degree focused on gendered social networks. Again, just a reminder, please mute yourself, everyone. And then our last speaker will be Danielle Musaji. She's director of the RISE, a nonprofit on the Cape Flats. Danielle is a social worker with a master's in social policy and management from UCT, and she has over 10 years experience in working with children and families on the flats. But she's also worked in the corporate sector and the field of change management. She's lectured and she's been involved in various community projects. She's been serving at Heideveld Presbyterian Church for over 9 years with her family, and she's passionate about ensuring that every child knows that they're loved by God and about challenging South Africans to connect with each other outside of their comfort zones. So it really is a privilege for all of us to be listening to the three of you today. Final reminder, everyone, please mute yourself. I'm hearing very strange sounds at the moment. And I'm going to hand over to Selina now. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Selina, and as Lisa's already said, I'm based at the Unit for Religion and Development Research at Stellenbosch University. Over the last few years, we've developed a strong focus on violence faced by children and the specific roles that local faith communities can play in placing children at the centre as an imperative of our faith. We also see how violence against women and violence against children can intersect in complex ways, especially in the home and family situations. We see that these can reinforce a vicious cycle of intergenerational violence, where children may normalise home violence and then may repeat its patterns as they grow up. So today's webinar is focusing on how faith communities can respond to issues facing children at this particular time of COVID-19. There's many issues I could talk about here because COVID-19 plays out in an already deeply unequal context here in South Africa. Many children already experience violence, are unprotected and struggle to get the basics that they need to thrive. But I'm going to highlight 3 important P's for children, like a good sermon: protection, participation, and provision. And I'm going to be pointing you in the chat to other resources that we don't have time to talk about today where you can go to learn more. So please keep an eye out for those. So we see in this slide, in a report just published by Christian organisation World Vision, and there'll be a link in the chat to that full report, the important task of listening to children's voices under COVID-19 is stressed. And the report notes 2 things in particular. First, the need for child protection in the light of new emerging risks. We know that children and young people are disproportionately affected by COVID-19 around the world due to school closures and a loss of access to many social safety nets. As the lockdown spread across the world, hundreds of millions of children worldwide stopped receiving school meals, and many parents were also unable to provide food after losing their livelihoods. We explored the specific issue of hunger and COVID in our first webinar, which you can find. Limited movement and disrupted communications have also prevented children from contacting their friends and relatives, often causing confusion, anxiety, and even despair. So we see that this isolation and confinement have put many children at increased risk of violence in the home and other forms of abuse, including child labour and online child abuse. Here in South Africa, we know that many children are significantly at risk in their homes already. So more enforced time in these spaces is a real concern to which we need to respond. We know that young children in particular really need routine and structure, and the constant uncertainty and disruption due to COVID-19 is very hard on them in particular. Protecting children from abuse and violence, providing for their basic needs, and creating positive spaces for them to thrive are key. At the same time, the report notes that children are also agents and rights holders. The issue of listening to children and equipping them to play a role in facing the challenges of COVID-19 and other life issues is very important, not only seeing them as helpless or passive victims in need of our protection as adults. Christina is going to be telling us a lot more about this, but it's important to show that the World Vision Report interviews children all across the world, showing how they're active as social actors, capable of shaping their environments, advocating for social change, and working towards the promotion and protection of their rights. Creating spaces for child activism in our local faith communities can transform the children involved in those communities and can also help to change society for the better as our social structures, including our churches and mosques, become more inclusive and responsive to children and their rights. And this is a call which many faith communities still need to hear. So the report showed that across 13 countries, the 100 children interviewed highlighted 3 big factors that have changed their lives under COVID-19. School disruption, as I've already mentioned, emotional distress due to social distancing, and third, increasing poverty. 71% of these children said that they felt isolated and lonely due to school closures, creating personal challenges in their own learning and daily routines, increasing their sense of isolation and even despair. 91% highlighted emotional distress and troubled feelings of anxiety, anger, and worry, especially around the uncertainty of how long this crisis will last. But despite these challenging feelings, all of the children said that they wanted to contribute to preventing the spread of COVID-19 in their communities by raising awareness about protecting people, informing their peers about risks, and helping the most vulnerable, including other vulnerable children. Next slide, please. So since 2018, I've been the lead researcher on a global study that explores specifically how faith actors can play a range of roles in protecting children from violence and abuse. And you can access this study in the link in the chat. One of the key findings of this study was that faith leaders play important roles at each level of the socio-ecological model, which you'll see up on your screens at the moment. This is used around the world by child protection experts. Faith actors also have a unique cross-cutting spiritual capital role. I'm not going to have much time to talk about that today, but there will be a link in the chat to a webinar that focuses directly on this theme, spiritual capital. What it means is that in these times of COVID-19, these different roles can make faith leaders important first responders to children. And again, on the chat, you'll find a 2-pager with 5 top tips about how faith leaders can be first responders to end violence against children, specifically under COVID. So we see in this slide that children sit within these wider circles of care and influence, family, communities, institutions, and then that national and international level around child rights and the various documents and proclamations that have been made there. Whilst churches and mosques often inhabit the community circle, faith also plays a cross-cutting role across all of the levels, shaping how children believe God sees them, what parents believe is their ethical responsibility in their caregiving tasks, whether faith communities reach out to provide safety nets for children at risk, or just retreat inwards, whether their institutions create spaces of danger for children or trusted persons to report abuse or neglect to, and have it taken seriously. Faith leaders often also play important lobbying roles at national levels. What they believe their faith says about how to treat children influences whether they work for legal reforms or may even seek to prevent them in the name of faith. But what we've found as we've explored this model is the levels of the child and the level of the family are particular areas of focus for local faith actors, and Christina and Danny are going to be speaking more about those 2 levels. We can help ensure that children are both seen and heard by creating regular spaces for their voices within child-friendly churches or mosques, and by engaging with our sacred texts and traditions through a child-centered lens to ensure that they do no harm. We can nurture child-centered approaches that link protection and participation and equip children as agents. Faith leaders like you in South Africa can also play an important role in recognising and referring children seen as at risk. Sunday school and youth programmes can, even in these virtual times, engage children directly to understand their value as created by and loved by God. We know that children can experience feelings of guilt, shame and isolation when they're abused. Faith communities can help children understand that they're not and that their bodies belong to them. Help build resilience in children as a regular presence supporting their safe nurture and their human dignity. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. No, just back one, please, Derek. Sorry. Back one slide, please.
Selena, it is on support. No, stay at supporting families, Derek.
Supporting
Selena's
families.
there.
Thank
It
you.
is.
I'm
yes.
behind us. Thank you. Supporting families. So, one of the insights was that at a family level, and these quotes point out the complexity of this, faith can offer practical hope and support to parents and other caregivers. And you'll see this from the first quote from the study. Religious leaders often have unique, trusted access to family life, and they can help identify children at risk or victims of violence, as well as raising awareness about child rights and caretaker obligations. Families can often protect children from harm and give them a safe and socializing container. However, because families can also be unsafe spaces for many children, the issue of violent discipline in particular also needs to be critically engaged by faith leaders who can help families to change harsh parenting practices and build nurturing relationships of trust rather than those of fear and punishment. Next slide, please. So as we move on to look at spiritual capital, which I think the slide is going to be coming up, it's probably already up for you guys. So I'm going to carry on.
It is.
Thank you, Lisa. Finally, faith offers this unique cross-cutting contribution of spiritual capital. And as I said, I'm not going to be able to go into this in the detail. So if this slide makes you excited, please go and look at the other webinar. This is where our religious doctrines, religious rituals, practices, experiences, and structures can play an important role in forming protective norms, beliefs, and attitudes for how children are to be seen and treated. But it also means that centre of the circle. So it's not just using our access and our social capital, but it's really getting to the heart of our spiritual capital. A misuse of Bible texts, for example, can present children as less important than adults, with fewer social rights or legal protections. And we know that this is a root cause of the violence and neglect of children. Faith communities must take active steps to challenge and change this. Under COVID, we're also seeing some new harmful beliefs emerging from certain faith leaders that can make children afraid. COVID is a punishment from God. The idea that it's prayer and miracles that will keep you safe, not hand washing and masks, and the dangers of stigma and discrimination, with people hiding their conditions or children being sidelined or silenced. Instead, and next slide, please. Instead, faith organisations can develop positive connections between child protection and faith by using a child rights lens that connects to religious themes, enabling sacred text reflections on dignity, justice and peace, with children as a key part of this. We can develop alternative religious and cultural rituals that place the best interests of the child at the centre of this. Our religious structures can help equip new faith leaders and existing faith leaders to see children as congregants and as citizens of the kingdom of God. The World Council of Churches in 2017 made a call to churches around the world to place children at the centre of Christian ministry and develop what they call child-friendly churches that focus on those 3 Ps that I started with: child protection, child participation, and the provision of a better world for children to thrive in. And there's going to be a link in the chat later on that will highlight that whole booklet from the World Council of Churches. These principles are at great risk in our COVID times. Faith communities are called to be God's hands in our specific times and places for children. For children, we can be hands that harm, hit, or silence children, or we can be hands that help and heal by placing children at the very centre of our social order, as Jesus did. And we see these 2 quotes here, the one from Desmond Tutu, building communities of trust where children are respected, and the need to break this silence where violence begets violence in our households. And the second quote, where Jesus's relationship with children places children at the centre of that new social order, receiving children as people in their own right and giving them status, respect, and dignity. So I want to end my little session, and then you're going to hear the really interesting stuff from Christina and Dani here in the Western Cape. But I want to end with a 1-minute video that reflects this hope that the virtual hands of faith communities can play in the lives of children. And then after that, Christina's going to take us on a deeper dive into child participation here in the Western Cape. And then Dani's going to explore her faith-based work on the Cape Flats with children to ensure that children are protected. Thank you. So Derek, if you can just play the video, that would be great. So just to say, we haven't got sound and it doesn't, we don't have sound, Derek. Sorry guys, just as we're getting the tech sorted, just to say this little clip's called Handscapes. So even if you can't hear the sound, it's actually still a lovely image to watch. So I'm hoping that Derek's going to be able to play it for us in a moment, and then we're going to move on to Christina.
I think, sorry, this is Lisa. I think if Christina, we can, oh, Derek, did you get it sorted? Otherwise, if we can,
move on. Yeah.
Let's move on to Christina. We can see also if we can find the link. Ooh, sound. Oh, no, it isn't.
Okay, over to you, Christina.
Good afternoon, everybody. So thanks, Dr. Palm, Dr. Leroux, for this opportunity. As you have said, I'm the Western Cape Commissioner for Children, and I have the privilege to be in direct conversation with children all the time. It's part of my job and what I love best about work in the children's rights sector. Colleagues and friends such as Mr. Nuswa from KZN will know how I love to engage and connect directly with children in child rights workshops to hear their views on matters. And so I've been able to ask 3 children from my children's government monitoring group about their impressions and opinions about children in faith settings and the COVID pandemic. And so I'm going to dive right in. You're going to hear their quotations and a little bit of my assessment of that. And that's how we will move through this part of the session. So I have Ms. J, who is 16 years old, and I've asked them, is there a space for children's voices in faith settings? And what they say to me is, Ms. J, sorry about that, says, like, nobody would ever really ask a child what they would like the message to be about, what they would like to see in church, or what they would like to sing. It's like you come into a church and everything is just handed to you. And I think that is why most children cannot sit still in church. Miss A, 17 years old, says, at my church, children are mostly separated from adults. I don't think they have a voice at church. It is mostly the elderly or the preacher that do. Mr. D, who's 15 years old, said, in the mosque, we listen to what the religious leaders or imams say. We do our prayers and listen to the imam's sermon, then we go home. So I think that this shows that children are aware of power hierarchies in faith institutions. Elders, adults, and leaders are ahead of children in that hierarchy, and that children's voices are in effect silenced by the perceptions of power in the faith institution or the exercise of that power. I went on to ask them, how can we promote children's voice? Ms. J, 16, said, allow certain services to be taken by the children, because in this way, you are allowing them to reach out to their peers. Churches should also allow team building activities to know how to bond or build with one another. This is why most kids don't come, because they don't have friends or nobody understands them. Miss A says, well, my church is more of an African strict type of church. We wear dresses and long skirts. I'd like to see it more free and allow people to dress how they like. In other words, adapt into the new change and not necessarily be that strict. She also talks about an adult who can be a mediator in this space. She says, elderlies at church believe children should respect the elderlies and should obey them. But I feel like it's actually fine for them, the elderlies, not to listen to children. So it's hard for children to stand up and be heard. There's a radio show on Umhlobo Wenene on Sunday morning where kids share their Bible verses, and the lady asks questions on how do they feel and what challenges do they face in the modern days. Then after that, she tries to make the elderly people understand it more. I think they do listen from that program a lot. She tries to teach the elderly people how to respect children and for children to respect elderlies. Mr. D, who's 15, says, the prophet said children should be loved and protected. The prophet never used to hit his children. He believed in talking to them. So I believe from these conversations with children, we learn that faith institutions provide an important space of belonging and bonding for children. Younger people cannot necessarily question traditions in faith institutions. This is their perception. Children could be consulted on the content of faith meetings, and children can contribute and lead faith meetings. So I went on to ask them also about faith communities during the COVID pandemic. Ms. J said, I think that during this time, so many people forget to pray and ask God for guidance, even though the church is a pillar. In this time, it became just another building. And that's not a bad thing, because the Spirit of God moves. It has no fixed destination. The Sunday school, for example, has been making special videos and has been sending services and lessons through social media. Miss A says at her church, well, they sent out food parcels to struggling church members and masks. They also sent small verses on WhatsApp group chats. Mr. D says, I personally think that it was the right decision to keep the mosque closed. As Muslims, when they pray, we need to stand shoulder to shoulder and no spaces must be between people. There will be no social distancing if this should not be applied. This is the right decision that the MJC has decided. During COVID pandemic, they sent messages and kept the sermons that happened during Jum'ah in mosque. It was broadcast over the radio. It was also live on Facebook. So the last conclusions that I draw on from these conversations with children is that children recognize the spiritual value of faith communities and institutions beyond the physical construction of the buildings for those gatherings. Technology was used more widely for communication by faith communities during this time, and we all know that children are naturals in this technological space. And lastly, I want to also reflect that children really recognize that faith institutions played a large role to alleviate hunger and also to provide PPE during this time of the COVID pandemic. Thank you for listening to the voices of children. I now hand over to Danielle to tell us more about her work.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. And thank you, Christina, for hearing from children. I'm always encouraged to hear children's voices and empowering them and advocating to listen to children. Well, today I'm going to be focusing on family strengthening in the time of COVID-19 and why it is so important. So next slide, a little bit about me for those who just joined. My name is Danielle Musaji. Everyone calls me Danny, so please feel free to do so. I'm a qualified social worker and have many years experience working with children and families, especially on the Cape Flats. And I really do have the privilege and the blessing to be leading such a wonderful team at Arise, where we strive to see all children and thriving families so that they can reach their full potential. Next slide, please. So at Arise, our vision is that every child is created by God to be in a thriving family. And based on this belief, we really work in 3 ways. One of those ways is that we work with existing families, trying to strengthen them so that families can thrive and that children can thrive and reach their full potential. And we do this through our various interventions, through our family and parenting support, as well as group work and group intervention with children and teenagers in our local schools and with our local organization, as well as we've developed an innovative family strengthening services where we work with the child and the caregiver's relationship, working on attachment and resilience so that children can have a good relationship with their parents. Secondly, because we know we don't live in an ideal world, there are many children that don't have families. And so at Arise, we really advocate for permanency. And so we work in our adoption support services where we support families who are thinking about or who have already adopted and trying to strengthen them so that their families too can thrive. And then thirdly, because we're very proud and we've seen the impact of the programs that we have written and developed ourselves, we now offer training and consultant services to organizations, churches, and schools where we can help other professionals who are working with children to help them thrive in all of their environments as well. Great, next slide. So at Arise, we work in the Cape Flats, and poverty, lack of employment, poor quality education, drug and alcohol addiction, violence, gangsterism, destroy local families and communities that we work with on the Cape Flats. Yet, at Arise, we refuse to accept these common stories of failures are the only option. And so we are committed to new stories of restored families and thriving children, of transformation. And so we believe that it's only through strengthening families that we will start to see lasting and sustainable change in our country. Resilience, attachments, and family preservation are the bedrock in which all of our programs are built. And we believe that family strengthening needs to be the cornerstone of change built into every development program across the sectors. Our family strengthening work focuses on building resilience, deepening relationships, nurturing strengths, growing problem-solving skills, and developing a sense of belonging in all our families, regardless of how our families are formed. And so we focus on families because we understand that families help children reach their full potential. The household that a child is born into dramatically affects the development and thus life outcomes of an individual. The general environment a child faces during the early life, especially from conception to about the age of 8 years old, are particularly important for developing skills and capabilities. And it is shaped by other members of the household, essentially the caregivers. And the reason why I use caregivers is because stats have shown that 57% of our children in our country do not live with a biological family. So where they're living is mostly with neighbors, with aunts, with a grandmother. And so that attachment and that sense of belonging to their biological parent is missing. The environment can either be enabling or disenabling. foundation for the development potential. So it's really important that we have a whole of family approach. Is a useful way of working with families experiencing the most significant and complex difficulties. And this approach consists of assessing and addressing the needs of children, adults, and the family, and ensuring that support is then provided to them. And this support is coordinated and focused on the concerns of the entire family. And that is why partnership is so important. We cannot work with children in isolation or in families with isolation, but we need to work together. Churches, our local organizations, schools, as well as the various departments working with children, so that children are not lost in the gaps of our society. So why resilience, attachment, and family preservation? Well, resilience really is the ability in the midst of hard things to look for opportunities, to ask for help, and to thrive, about forging connection and learning problem-solving skills and executive functioning. So, for example, I'd love to take gangsters and poverty away from our children, but unfortunately, it is an overwhelming problem. So how can I help families and children thrive regardless of the environment they're faced with? Well, with the various programs that we offer through our emotional literacy programs, with dealing with our behavior, thinking about decisions, thinking about our faith, we help children and families give the necessary problem-solving tools to overcome the many adversities that our families and our children are facing. Attachment is so important. We understand now why families are important, but attachment is so much more. It is the family song, the dance between our partners, siblings, and parents, and the child of pursuing a connection. Research shows that if we want children to overcome that poverty trap, they only need 3 things. 1, they need to be able to have access to quality education. 2, they need only one caregiver that is able to give them that nurture, that love, that motivation, and that belief in themselves, and that protection that they need to overcome and to be able to be able to kind of get through the schooling. And thirdly, that caregiver needs support themselves to be able to continue to give the child the relationship that they need. And then thirdly, family preservation. How do we help families to function and stay together? We need to be able to look at not only our environment, but our political and social climate and injustices in our country. And it's about helping children to be able to make different decisions to what other generations have made before. We see family preservation as work as we do to strengthen our families, build attachment, communication, and resilience. So what's been happening during COVID-19? Next slide, please. Well, since the lockdown started at the end of March, we have seen a massive increase in gender-based and domestic violence nationally as well as internationally. And global research has found that 1 in 4 women are affected by domestic violence in the home. And 2 out of 3 children, especially in our country, are impacted by violence within their home. And so there's been a lot of discussion about how do we help and keep adult partners safe during lockdown, but a little has been done to help our children who fall victim to abuse. Children who now do not have a phone to pick up and call for help, who are no longer being able to access a teacher or a neighbor who might otherwise intervene, especially those who are in vulnerable communities. And we know that the low numbers of child abuse reports right now during lockdown have occurred is not an accurate reflection of what is going on behind doors. Children continue to be abused and neglected, and potentially an increasing higher level now that adults in their lives are experiencing so much more stress than ever before. So these numbers simply mean that this abuse is going unreported and undocumented. And it is without a doubt that the pandemic will continue to increase statutory social workers' workload. And we already know that most statutory social workers have cases between 100 to 200 cases. And so we're going to see a lot more child abuse cases coming up, especially when schools reopen. And so we have found that, especially in our marginalized communities on the Cape Flats, accessing data or electronics to receive their schoolwork is much more difficult than ever before. And in fact, many of our children find our schools as a safe place where they are able to be in a safe place away from parents or adults in their lives that are abusing them. School is a place where they find food, where they get their one meal a day. And so a lot of the schools that are closed means that our children are more at risk in dropping out of school, being recruited to be part of gangs. We're seeing a lot in our communities, young children, boys at the age of 9 to 10 being recruited in gangsterism on the Cape Flats. And so we need to ask ourselves, how many more dropout rates will result because of this time away from the classroom? How many more people will be recruited to gangs? And how many more people will sink deeper into the addiction to escape and to belong? And that is why family strengthening is really, really important. Next slide, please. So at Arise, because of COVID, we'd had to adapt. Can I get the next slide, please? Right. So we've had we've obviously done a lot of work with families. We've done individual intake, and so that had to change. And so what we've done is to meet the needs of our communities, which is to provide food parcels for many of our families. But what we've done very uniquely is to ensure the safety of our children and our families. We have dropped off food parcels directly to the home. So we've done many, many home visits so that we can keep in touch with our families. A lot of them are grandmothers that are looking after many children with behavioral problems and not coping. We've developed a WhatsApp group for our caregivers and our children so that they can continue to get messages of hope, can continue working on strengthening their families, as well as we've developed family strengthening kits, which is a low resource tool. Each family gets a toolkit of activities and things that they can do with children. And we focused on 5 key areas. One is have family time. How can you have fun with your families? And in that way, we are strengthening connection, we are strengthening attachments. It's looking at coping with emotions. So talking about the feelings, what's making you angry, what's making you sad. Also, there's some reflective work for parents to reflect on what's going on with themselves. There's also a part of having hard conversations. So how do we talk about death? How do we talk about divorce? How do we talk about not seeing friends and being away from school? As well as discipline. How do we continue doing positive and gentle parenting so that we can strengthen our attachment and also reduce that abuse and neglect and punitive discipline as well? We also are able to move a lot of our things online, and obviously working on the Cape Flats, people don't have that access. So we're doing voice notes, we're doing WhatsApp groups, and then home visits as well. Next slide, please. So really what we would like to see is that every department, every organization, being it faith-based organizations, churches, mosques, schools, local communities, anyone working with children, we need to work with families, because at the end of the day, our children go back into the home and they need to feel that sense of belonging. They need to feel safe and they need to be protected. And so really what we believe is once we strengthen families, we can strengthen communities where children can feel safe and can reach their full potential. Thank you so much, and I will hand back over to Dr. Paul.
Thank you so much, Danny. It might just be noise on my side, but I think someone's unmuted. I really hope it's not me making all the noise. But thank you so much to our 3 speakers. so many thoughts running through my head, so I can only imagine how it feels for the rest of you as well. We're now going to move into a Q&A. I want to invite all of you, please use the chat box. You can post specific questions, but it can also be a bit more vague than that. Post dilemmas that you're facing. So very often we have situations and we don't actually even know what questions to ask to be able to sort it out. So feel free to share those in the text box and in the chat box, and I will communicate that and ask questions to our presenters. I'm going to ask Christina, Danny, and Selena to show themselves. And we're going to start this Q&A with a question to Christina, please. So the voices of the children that you brought in, that you shared with us, and thank you so much. That was really so almost tangible to hear them here in this space with us. You spoke that this was from your children's government monitoring group, and I was wondering, what can we learn from you about how you set up this group? How do you consult with this group? And what lessons can faith leaders in their different faith communities learn from this process that you're running in terms of talking to children and consulting with children on your work? Christina, please.
Thanks very much. Yes, the first thing I'd like to say is the ideal is that children should be able to be self-advocates. Ideally, I would have liked children to be speaking for themselves. I don't like this being the intermediary between children and everybody else, but they didn't feel safe enough to be able to expose themselves and their views at the same time. And we need to really reflect on why that's the case. And so for me, I think there's definitely a trust building process that is integral to how I do my work with children. From the first day that I was appointed as Children's Commissioner, I already had started to invite children to be part of an advisory council for my work. So not only are they going to be helping me in my monitoring role, but that I'm actually in daily conversation with this group of about 30 children from across the province. And yes, it takes a lot of effort and energy to be accessible to children all the time. And so you have to have a particular aptitude and a particular attitude to be able to connect with children all the time. You play the role of mentor, and from my perspective, you never let go of that. I don't ever pull away from a child who's invited me into their lives. I wait for them to move on. They go to university, they get married, whatever, and then they don't need me as much in their lives anymore. So this particular connection is built really on trust and on a strong commitment to ethics around child participation. There's many layers of ethical children's participation practice that we need to acquaint ourselves with before we just jump into a relationship where we expect children to trust us. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Christina. I think we might actually circle back to this as well with the next question that was posted. Let me just find it here. If you can really give some practical tips. So you're working within this government space, which is slightly different from the faith space in some ways not so much. But if you can give practical tips for faith leaders that want to work in this kind of way with children, that want to really listen to children on the child term. I know I'm putting you on the spot a bit with this, but if you can get really practical from the lessons that you've learned in doing that, please.
Sure. So I'm going to transpose some of the lessons. So if I have, for example, reached out to children who are social activists in their communities, they are part of the RCLs, or they're part of peace builders, so these are children who want to be active in the work of citizenship building. In the faith community, you have children who want to be part of faith meetings. They form part of your youth groups. They form part of your Sunday school. And so being able to connect with them in the spaces that they are comfortable with, as that opening of the communication channels, and really, I want to say, a deconstruction of the power hierarchies that do exist. And so when that deconstruction and that willingness to be open and to work together as partners, then we will see that the children will take you into their trust, and the relationship will grow from there.
Thank you, Christina. And what I hear from that, what really stands out to me is there is a intentional decision to kind of put down that power hat that you're wearing as a pastor or a priest or a imam, which is not always the easiest step for us as adults to take. So thank you for challenging us in that way. I'm going to engage with a number of questions from different people in different ways, but what I'm seeing is that there is a real need for tangibles. This is directed at you, Christina, you, Selena, but also you, Danny, about is your toolbox available to everyone? Do you have programs or frameworks that you use to empower families that you can recommend that's available for churches or nonprofits to work? So, I mean, when all three of you were speaking, you were referring to so many things that, we felt, oh, wait, is that available on the internet? Can I read that? What is in that family strengthening kit, Danny? Can each of you in turn, maybe Danny, if we can start with you, then Selena, then Christina. What do you have that other people, that we in our different spaces can also access to support our own efforts to support children? Danny and Selena, if you can add your video, please.
Is my video's on? Yeah, so in terms of the family strengthening kits, it is available at the moment. We've piloted and delivered boxes to our families in our area, but we are going to be able to partner with other organizations who are wanting the family strengthening kits and putting it together for you. Yeah, just message us and email us, and we can see what we can do in terms of that. The value of the boxes are 300 Rand, but it includes everything: paint, Play-Doh, crayons, everything that families need to do the activities that has been included in the packs as well. But yes, you can always email us and go on our website, and we'll be able to chat further. In terms of the programs, yes, so we offer training for churches, for any professional really who works with children, in our various programs that we have written, to be able to help children in regards to their feelings. We have, so at the moment we have training around, one is called Man in the Mirror, which is looking at building resilience in our young males. So when we talk about gender-based violence, we can't talk about just women, we need to talk about boys as well. And so really that group is around how do we build resilience within them. Secondly, we have a group called Fierce around self-esteem and self-worth for our young girls, as well as our third course, which is Finding Feelings, which is an emotional literacy group for grade 1s and 2s. But all of these programs are adaptable to your community. So the training really is about how do you adapt it to your community, because every community is different. And then again, every program has a parenting feedback. So how do we get parents involved? Because I always say, parents can see a dozen social workers, a dozen psychologists, but it means nothing if children are not hearing it from their parents that they are special and that they are loved. And so really it's important that we work with parents. But in terms of churches that are or faith-based organizations looking, please contact us. We do consult. So even if you're looking at different ways, we can start helping you think around your community and the needs of your children and your teens and your community, because everything looks different.
Thanks, Danny. Selena, are you there still?
Yes, I am.
I'm not seeing you though.
Okay.
There, you're joining. Yeah. No. I think it's just slow.
Great. So I think two things to say here. One, there are some really interesting global models, like World Vision celebrating families. You know, models that really focus on the family and on ways to support and strengthen families. And some of the links that I've given you in the chat point to like hubs where you actually have different toolkits. The Viva Child Protection Toolkit is being used by Connect here in the Western Cape to train faith leaders around basic child protection and safety for children within churches. So I think there are toolkits and things like that, but the danger is that we're all looking for that magic toolkit that's going to be the answer to all of our challenges. And I think one of the things I've learned, particularly in my own faith community and church, is to start where you are. You know, I really enjoyed listening to Christina sort of surfacing those voices of children. And I think we have really basic resources, you know, get some Play-Doh and sit down on the floor with children. Now, I know we can all go, yes, but COVID, but it's equipping families to start doing that. And really, really basic resources by which parents start to talk to their children or engage with them, but using play as the way in, rather than expecting a child to sit down and immediately have a serious conversation with you. Start with a play-based methodology. And I think, you know, churches historically have amazing spaces to do that. I know that we sit in COVID times, so now we all sort of say, oh, but now we can't meet together. But I think there are really creative ways where we can do that. So in my own congregation, our young people have really taken a role in helping us move our services online. You know, they're brilliant with this stuff, much better than a lot of us adults. And they've really started to take a leadership role in terms of videos, in terms of stories, in terms of worship, all sorts of ways where we're not just creating content that reaches children, but we're involving children in that content itself and allowing voices. One of the loveliest things this week for me is that one of our young people helped us with our worship at church. So she sang various songs and she was videoed by another young person, you know, all long distance to go onto the virtual service. But one little 3-year-old who watched it at home with her parents then sent a voice note back to the pastor and to the woman who'd done the singing, saying that she'd really, really loved the singing and it was her favourite part of the service. And this young woman said that that was the best compliment she'd ever got. But what it reminded us of is that even if our services are virtual or our children are confined to their homes, there are so many small ways in which we can help and support parents to connect with their children, children's voices to be heard directly, not always mediated, and for children to sort of be active in being the welcomers in our virtual church services, playing songs, telling stories. Our Holy Circus team at our church really do that. And I think it's important that we start where we are with the strengths that we already have as churches. I really agree with what Christina said about changing the hierarchy, but that doesn't have to be turning everything upside down all at once. It can actually be about saying, instead of having 3 adults do our welcome and our song, we're going to have 3 children, and we're not just going to tell them what to say, we're going to ask them what they would like to say. And as we start doing that, we start to overturn the idea that children feel, and they do often feel, that they should be seen but not heard. COVID presents us with a unique opportunity to make sure that children are also heard in different ways. So yes, there's not a magic bullet. There's lots of small things that we can do. That's me.
Christina, do you have the magic bullet that they're denying exists?
The elusive magic bullet. Bullets are violent, people. Let's not talk about bullets. So I think that I appreciate the work that Danielle and our organization have done. We've done similar work in other organizations in civil society, and it's important to get that kind of skills built within our communities, within our families, within the relationships. And so that's a great place to start with renewing and healing relationships. But as far as, you know, really connecting with children, I think we have to go with the orientation of change starts with me. So it's going to have to be an introspection about what I always do with adults when I talk about child rights work is I ask adults to reconnect with their own childhood. I always say that at 18, people develop amnesia about childhood, and we all of a sudden no longer able to connect with children and childhoods because we are adult now. And I think that we need to open that blockage that we've created so that we can really connect with our own childhoods, connect with the child within, and then be able to freely connect with children around us in the modern time. So there's no quick way to do this. In fact, it's going to take lots of introspection and perhaps even changing of hearts and minds. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. I'm going to go over to a question that Etienne Claessens posted, and I think this is very good because it brings our focus a bit back to COVID-19, because I think a lot of what we've been discussing today is really broader things for our faith communities and for adults and families in their relationships towards children. It isn't, these were issues that we had before COVID turned up. But Etienne helps us maybe to focus specifically on the reality that we're in right now by asking, how do you overcome the restrictions in physical contact restrictions? And all three of you, this is directed at all three of you, so start thinking of your answers. It feels like the programs and initiatives are waiting for lockdown restrictions to be lifted before it would be effective. Using remote connection feels ineffective as it is reliant on availability of technology as well as participation of people. We also need to consider whether they're exposing children to potential COVID-19 infection. We have little to no contact with children because of closed schools and parents trying to protect their kids. As a result, most programs are reliant on physical influence have come to a halt or moved to ineffective social media forms. So I'm again kind of putting you on the spot here, but I think Etienne is raising a very important point. Now, Danny, I'm going to ask you to start again because, you know, that one slide that you showed how you went from your old model to your COVID-19 way of doing your programming. If you can give some concrete tips around what you've learned about that, and then maybe if we circle then back to Selena and Christina from your different spheres, how have you adapted your programming with these physical restrictions that we're facing? Please, Danny.
Can you hear me now? Great. Yeah, I mean, it's really, really difficult. I find myself in a unique position that I am able to lead an organization in the same community that I do church in. So the two have kind of overlapped and adapted. And so really the first 3 weeks, when we closed in the beginning, we were like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? Knowing our families and knowing the complex needs and situation that a lot of our kids are also are in. So at the time, we were dealing with a lot of children dropping out of school and working with teachers to keep them in school, as well as with parents dealing with behavioral problems, and then all of a sudden nothing. And I know as a professional going, oh my goodness, if nothing's happening, the situation's only getting worse. How do we help these families? And then slowly but surely what we started to do was doing WhatsApp groups, because our families don't have access to the internet, but they do have phones. And so we had to do that. Some people don't even have data enough to do videos, so then we had to do voice notes. If not, then we got our team to do phone calls. So then we are phoning families and checking in and going, hi, how's it, what's it going? Then as the restrictions and regulations started lifting, we had to go, well, how do we see people face to face? And obviously seeing the need of food. And so we brought the two together with going, well, we're going to drop food parcels and then we're going to do it at their homes. One, we didn't want a big group around our building because that also causes issues, but also knocking on the door and being able to do a safe visit being able to ask people questions, seeing the home as well kind of gives you where our kids are at, and knowing our community. So that's what we've done. We then partnered with 3 other churches in our community, so we were able to visit their families as well and equip their pastors to be able to do home visits as well, and kind of, you know, what things you need to look out for, especially children that is in your congregation that you're already a little bit worried about what's going on in that home. And then what happened was we had 5 cases out of those home visits that there had to be intervention done because there was abuse in the home, and we were able to guide the pastor and the children's worker to go, how do we keep the family still going and doing the work that needs to be doing, and how do we keep that child safe? So it's really, I know Christina pointed that out, but we need to work together. We cannot work in isolation. I am a big push for partnership. And so if a church is going, how are we going to do this? Find another organization that is doing work, that is doing food parcels, and go, how can we work together so that there's a win-win situation, that we are able to keep an eye on our children that need to keep an eye on, as well as that we'll be able to give messages. So even with our food parcels, we were able to drop off a card. There was a teenager in Plumstead, a more affluent community, who baked muffins for all the families and a note to bring hope, and that was such a nice touch. And then we encouraging children from affluent communities to go, there are ways to give back, and looking at various needs. So you need to look at your community, and you need to know what is their needs and what does the children need, and then being able to adapt in those ways.
Thank you, Danny. Selena.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with everything that Danny says, and that whole idea of what is local to you. You know, I think sometimes we'll sort of think as a church, you know, oh, but our specific program can't continue, and that's our children's ministry. Whereas I think there are suddenly different ways now we're confined maybe to particular localities, where we actually have to think, well, who are the children in my area, and what could I do to support them? And I think there's also an awareness, like those things like WhatsApp and voice notes and calling trees all become really, really important mechanisms for supporting parents. I think all of us have kind of highlighted that incredibly important role of caregivers, and especially in the light of what Danny was saying about how many children aren't necessarily living with their biological parents. There's this increased stress and pressure on parents with children at home all of the time. And I think there's such important ways in which a children's ministry is also about strengthening those circles of care and support. So we don't need to say, well, we can't have Sunday school because we don't have children's ministry, or how do we start that back up, even though there's risks. We actually say our ministry takes on a different form in this context. And actually the mental health and psychosocial support provided to parents, but also the ways in which children's voices can come through within those spaces. So it's not just automatic that you only talk to the parent, but that actually children are treated as full individuals within that family and are also engaged with, I think provides this incredibly important dimension of ministry that sometimes churches have been doing that, but I think in a sense by now only being able to do that, we really see the incredible value of that. And like Danny said, it's not doing that on our own, but it's linking to those other networks so that you can provide a support. We certainly in my congregation will say we've actually been more intentional about reaching out pastorally to everybody that's been on our list with a phone call, or with hooking up people in particular areas to reach out to the 5 or 6 people around them. We've ironically been more intentional about that under the COVID-19 period than we were when people were just turning up at church. And we're finding all sorts of different people who weren't able to come, or who were being left behind, or who actually feel much more comfortable in these sorts of new spaces. So I do think that sort of business as normal can't always happen, and sometimes we can't adapt our programs as they were. But I think as churches and mosques and communities of faith, we shouldn't be confined to buildings or confined to physical meetings. I think there are lots of creative ways in which we can respond to those feelings. And I think in my congregation, we've really thought about what does it mean to be lonely and isolated. And we can't necessarily take those away, but we've really asked, all ages of people in our congregation, what might help. So that whole thing that Christina's been saying about listen to children's voices, I think it's really important as churches that instead of carrying on with our programs as normal, we maybe stop and say, what actually is it that is most needed at this point in time? And for us, in our congregation, there's a lot of mental health issues that are really emerging. There's a lot of anxiety. So people might even say, and I'm aware that it's privileged to have technology, but like little moment meditations or little moments for parents to just kind of speak to somebody else. Those tiny little things can actually be lifesavers in a moment where a family can turn violent or where a child can feel really despairing. So for me, it's kind of about thinking about ministry differently, and being prepared to step away sometimes from the everyday programs that we're used to running as churches and find new ways to do that.
Thanks, Selena. Christina, your thoughts, please.
It may surprise you to know that the 3 children who entrusted me with their feelings, I have never met them. I've never physically met them. And I know them for only 2 months. We know each other via WhatsApp group and via WhatsApp direct messaging, and me making telephone calls to them and to their parents occasionally to inform them about the program that we run. And I've been actually also able to conduct from June to now 6 training sessions on children's rights, levels and structures and branches of government, multidimensional child poverty. The sky is the limit, people. I don't understand boxes and boundaries and the new normal. I think if you want to connect with children, there's nothing that will stop you, not even a global pandemic. Thank you.
And that is the kind of positive note that we want to end that discussion on. Thanks, Christina. I want to raise a question that Jaylee posted on the chat box. And I'm going to swing our order around. So it's going to be Christina, then Selena, then Danny. Then Danny gets a bit of time to think this round. And Jaylee asks, how do we encourage and inspire parents or adults to interact with their children in a more holistic way and to strengthen bonds with their children if pre-COVID that link and encounter was missing? How do we encourage parents to do activities with their kids that promote general well-being, emotional intelligence, and development if they lack the skills to do so? It seems like some parents or adults relied heavily on schools and church to provide these services to their kids and are now struggling to engage with their kids in these important ways. I think it's a really key issue that Jaylee's raising here, and it would be lovely to hear your input. Christina, if we start with you this time.
I'm going to use a 4-letter word, if I may. I'm always a troublemaker, so you have to watch out for me. But there's magic for me in play, P-L-A-Y. So if you just reconnect with your own child during play, having them initiate the type of activity that they want to do, request to be invited into that space and start to play together, I think you will see things shifting already. There are tiny mechanisms that really unlock past or healing from the past, trauma from the past. And I think for me personally, I always use play as that first mechanism to unlock relationships with children.
Thank you, Christina. Selena. You're muted.
Right, sorry, my tech was playing up. Sorry. I'm getting all distracted because there's some lovely, I think, little COVID resources that have been developed, like little hero books, and just very, very simple psychosocial supports that are as simple as sitting and reading a story together. And these are sendable over WhatsApp. And I know I've got 2 little goddaughters, one who lives in Langer and one who lives in Kailicha, who very much have access to very few resources. But I've been very struck by how these small little ways to engage playfully through a story, through a game, through a jigsaw, can enable caregivers and children to connect, even across generations, grandmothers and children. And I think parents often feel a huge pressure, now I must do all the things like they did in school, and I must get it right, and maybe I don't know the answer to the maths homework or this or that. And I do think one of the things we see, especially with younger children, is the incredible importance of that 4-letter word that Christina mentioned, PLAY. And I think often caregivers feel like this isn't so important, and it's all the learning that must happen and must be serious. But what we see is that children really are grappling with a lot of anxiety at this time, and play is one of the ways in which children and adults can help relinquish that anxiety by actually being able to play together and to become calmer. And I think that sometimes we underestimate the incredible value of that for the lessons that will be learned through this time. We worry too much about falling behind on tests. And I'm not saying that those things aren't important, but what we've learned is that the psychosocial well-being of a child actually requires these very basic playful, whether the adult doesn't have to know the answers, and the child must be the one that asks the questions, but where in a really, really simple playing together, and again, we can sort of think, but we all need important resources. This could be as simple as a newspaper or a magazine that's cut up into pieces, and then as an adult and a child, we put the pieces back together again. And I think it's about valuing those sorts of things and taking them seriously. I've been interested, as I've spoken to some very young children over this time, how excited they are just to have their parents around or their caregivers around more. Like, even though they're stressed, they'll sort of say, there's been things we've been able to do, we've been able to play together because my parents, and for some of them, particularly their fathers, or their male caregivers, have actually been available more often, and that children have sometimes really, really enjoyed that. And I think there is an opportunity there for the actual activity of playing together to in itself be a way of bonding. So I really understand, Jaylee, what you're saying, that if that bond wasn't there, and now there's COVID, but that's why I think in some ways, even though COVID is a crisis, it is also an opportunity, because suddenly parents and children are together, often a lot more than they've been in the past. And I think there are then opportunities in really, really small, basic ways for parents and children to rediscover the value of playing together. And the thing is, the adult is not in control in a play space. Children know how to play. They are experts in playing. And I think what we therefore need to do as adults is say, you tell me what to do and I'll follow you. And I'm astonished when I allow a 5-year-old to dictate the next 2 hours of my day, how much fun I can then end up having in that process. So it's maybe an opportunity for us to start that learning, which I think is desperately needed in a South African context.
Thank you, Selena. Danny?
Yeah, I mean, I think Christina and Selena said everything. Yeah, you need to connect with your children. So how do you encourage parents, I think, is what I hear. And I think it's important to go, you need to be self-aware of yourself. And as Christina said before, you need to tap in your inner child, because that inner child needs to come out. And it's finding, it's not the quantity of time, but it's that quality of time. And that's what I always tell my parents. Date your children, get to know what they like and do it with them. And you can connect in various ways. It doesn't mean that you have to keep playing. At the moment in my house is being superheroes. So we get dressed up and, you know, I'm usually Captain America and my son is someone else, and we go around and we fight the bad guys. But it's also get them involved in your daily things. So we're going to do the laundry together. Come, let's put the dirty washing in. Let's go hang up your washing. Get them involved in cooking with food. I find that my kids specifically talk a lot about their day and which friends don't want to play with them while we, you know, cutting potatoes or doing those kind of things. So find things in your home, and that's how I encourage my parents, that you're still getting things done, but your children are part of it as well, which is so important. And it's asking them, and it's also role playing. So as parents, it's also role playing. How do we speak to each other? So mommy had a really bad day today. I didn't get along with my colleague. You know, usually we say auntie and uncle. So I say, you know, Auntie Robin, we didn't get along today. We didn't agree on something, and that made me feel very sad. again, I'm role playing with my child. It's okay to talk about our feelings. How was your day? And I've kind of let my husband get in that as well, you know, come, let's talk about your feelings. And so, you know, the wonderful thing about attachment is that it can be strengthened. And so you can work on that, but it is being consistent, and you need to be consistent. Not one day we're going to play all this time together and tomorrow we're not. Ensure that in the day you're spending quality time with your kids, connecting, playing, and asking those questions about how you're feeling and what's going on. So yeah, just a summary of what's being said.
Thank you so much, Danny and Christina and Selena. I'm going to put the three of you on the spot for a final time and giving each of you like a minute for your final thoughts based on what you presented, on what we spoke about later, the things that people raised in the chat box. Maybe just those last thoughts that you want to leave us with. And I'm switching it up by asking Selena to go first, Christina second, and then Danny.
Thank you, Lisa. Absolutely no time to think about my 1 minute, which is fine. Oh, so much is going through my head. I think I just want to pick up on that last word which Danny said, that notion of attachment can be strengthened. And I know that we all feel like we're grappling with these constrained circumstances that make us smaller and that create a smaller space and confront us with all of these challenges. But I also want us to remember that adversity strengthens resilience as well. Like that when we have these conversations with our children about how are you feeling? How am I feeling? How is this difficult? As we have those conversations, we are actually potentially strengthening those attachment bonds. And then ironically, all of those things which we actually know we want in our wider society can actually, you know, COVID can in a sense be a crucible where, yes, there's additional pressure, but we're also learning new strategies, and we're learning to speak differently and to engage differently and to listen differently. And as Danny also said, to role model. So we know I do a lot of work around the sort of, you know, bottom rung of the ladder, preventing child violence. But what we see over and over again is so much of preventing the negative is nurturing the positive. And we can sometimes think, oh, well, when things get easier or when things get better, then we'll have time for the positive. But actually, it can sometimes be the other way around. It's at the moments where it's hardest, at the moment where we want to yell or scream or not have time, or we're worried about all sorts of things, that at the same time, if we can catch a moment to actually be mindful and be present and to play and to engage with both the negative and positive feelings of ourselves, but also our children, and reconnect that inner child, I think we start to create context where violence becomes less likely. And, you know, we live in a context in South Africa where there's incredibly high levels of violence and abuse of children before we even get to COVID. And that can make us despair. But I think as faith communities, we really do, in virtual and in physical ways, have opportunities to connect to people, to connect to families, and to connect to the voices of children in different spaces, and to offer them playful and story-based spaces, whether it's virtually or physically, to start to remap, like Christina said, that hierarchy, that power hierarchy. So that, like, my hope is that children, when they start coming back into our church space and things do start opening up, they'll say, but this is a place where I am seen and heard. And this, even when it wasn't a place that I could come to, there were still ways for me to be seen and heard. And now I'm excited to come back. There are a couple of things in Christina's comments that made me feel sad about the hierarchy in our structures. And this really often lies at the root of a lot of child violence, that we see children as less important. And I think in small ways, if we can start to turn that around, it means that when our spaces do start to reopen, we have actually done some thinking about how they can actually be more child friendly, and to see this time as an opportunity for us to listen, to rethink, and to reopen those spaces, not in the same way as they were before, but in different ways. So that's me.
Thanks, Selena. Christina?
I think I want to use the opportunity to encourage all of us on the call who are adults, basically, to do some self-introspection, to become more authentic, to be able to be open to the invitations that children give us on a daily basis. Children are so excited and so unassuming and so eager to connect and build relationships. They're waiting for us. All we need to do is be ready to connect with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. And sorry, I think someone, I'll just mute him. And then lastly, Danny, can we hear your final thoughts, please?
Yeah, in terms of faith-based and being a Christian, I really do believe the gospel is about relationship. And we need to have good relationships with the children that we're working with and the children that are around us and our families. And so relationships do look different now, but it's really important to go, how can I continue having a good relationship with the people that I serve and is around me in our community? So having a phone call, for us at our church, what we've done is have our birthday list of all of our kids and ensuring that we can phone them and wish them a happy birthday. And how special do they feel when we remember their birthdays? A lot of our kids don't even celebrate their birthdays, and so we know that's really important. Or if we know that something's happening in the community, is phoning and just walking that journey. And it's a difficult journey sometimes, but people need to feel that there's a space that they go to that is safe, and that there are strengths wherever we look. And so it's finding those strengths. Even with the kids that we work with, sometimes our kids do put some pressure on us, but it's looking for those strengths. So for example, if a child goes, they've bunked school, but they got 5 other boys to bunk school with me, I'm going, you have leadership abilities within yourself. And so it's finding those skills and how do we harness those strengths already within themselves. And so don't look always at the problem, but look at the strengths that people bring within themselves. Even when it feels like parents are really struggling or they don't have time, but they're showing up. They're coming to your church, they're coming to your organization, and that is a big strength on its own. And so we need to be around and supporting our families and our kids in relationship. And how does that look like? And it's going to look different for everyone sitting here in this forum today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Danny. And I want to, we're out of time, so I'm going to bring this in to close. I want to thank our 3 presenters for what they shared with us today. You've made us think, and you've challenged us on so many levels. So thank you so much for that. I want to thank everyone who joined us today for making time to do so, because I know you're all busy. So thank you. A special thanks to those who participated in the chat box. So thank you for guiding this reflection through your questions and your comments. Please remember that the recording of this webinar will be made available. The link was posted in the chat box, so it will be on the URDR website, probably on the Faculty of Theology's Facebook page as well, and feel free to share with your networks. Yes, that is it. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. Stay safe and stay warm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.